today from our PLP partners, the World Bank, ADB, USP, and SPRED. Again, we welcome you all. This is our fourth module in our final round of trainings. And again, I take this opportunity to thank everyone who is joining us today from all around the Pacific region. I see a good representation from Micronesia, Polynesia, and our Melanesian islands. And also a big thank you to our presenters, Ms. Natasha Vetma, and also Dr. Hilda from the USB. Ms. Natasha is our World Bank presenter. And so thank you again, ladies, for availing your time to do our presentation, our training today. Just a reminder to our participants and our presenters that we do have some IT internet connection challenges. So just be prepared for that. We might go on and then suddenly off, but you will come back on. So don't worry about that. Also, I hope everybody had a good long weekend with the Easter holidays and now ready to get back to work. And also another reminder, it's a very important one, to please fill in your evaluation survey forms that will be emailed to you, and it'll be in the link will be on in our chat box. Click on it and do your evaluation after this training. This is very important. It will also determine you getting your certificate after the training. So please don't forget to fill in your evaluation survey form. And also just a reminder, all of our presentation video and PowerPoints, it will be uploaded onto the PNEA portal. So please do access that information. It's all free. And if you're not registered, you need to register so that you can log in and get that information. So please remember to do that. And now just to get back to our training for today, module 20 that is titled Managing Development Risks and Impacts on Biodiversity and Protected Areas in the Pacific. I will just read the narrative behind this module to remind us of the need for this module. It's in our training plan, and I'll just read it here. The World Bank's 6th Environmental and Social Standard, that is the ESS 6, recognizes that protecting and conserving biodiversity and sustainably managing living natural resources are fundamental to sustainable development. Biodiversity is defined as the variability among living organisms from all sources, including inter alia, terrestrial, marine, and other aquatic ecosystems and the ecological complexes of which they are a part. This includes diversity within species, between species, and of ecosystems. Biodiversity often underpins ecosystem services valued by humans. Impacts on biodiversity, terrestrial, coastal, and marine can therefore often adversely affect the delivery of ecosystem services. This module will offer learning on the details of ESS 6 and the various approaches that guide its application in projects across the Pacific. And so our learning objectives for this module aims to, 1, introduce participants to the scope, requirements, and procedures for applying ESS 6 in all World Bank investment project financing. 2, explain a differentiated risk management approach to habitats based on their sensitivity and values. And 3, explain the application of the mitigation hierarchy inclusive of biodiversity offsets and the principle of like for like or better. And that will be presented by Ms. Natasha Vetma. And we also have our co-presenter from USB, Dr. Hilda Wakasakiti. She will be presenting on biodiversity and in the Pacific, and how it links to EIA. And so without further ado, I will now hand it over to our lead presenter and co-presenter to present on our topic for today. Thank you for your patience and enjoy your module for today. Apetai. Natasha, I think you're on mute.
Let me start again. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Oferia, for introducing our session and also the presenters. So myself and Hilda will do this core presentation, but we also had quite a help from my colleague Suzanne in preparing, putting all this together. So just to give you a bit of the background, how I plan to do this. So it's going to be, I would say, some 40 minutes of presentation, really looking at the three areas that Oferia mentioned, and that is what is ESS 6, what is mitigation hierarchy, and how we use differentiated approach to habitats. And in trying to kind of make this more a discussion than just very dry presentation, we also have one small quiz in the middle, which definitely is not a quiz that has definite answers, very clear. And you will see that sometimes when we deal with biodiversity and assessing the values, it's not very clear. It's not black and white. It's not very precise, and we need to use, in many cases, a judgment call for defining what needs to be protected in such way. So let me start, and just bear with me for 1 minute so that I share the proper screen. I will just see now, just give me a second. Okay. Tell me if you see the presentation.
Yes, I can see it.
Thank you. So let us just start. I already mentioned what are we going to talk about. So let me just go to the next slide. Okay, so one of the big questions is, why do we actually focus on biodiversity and conservation? And I think Oferia already started that. So when we talk about development, and in these days we do want to talk about sustainable development, we recognize that protecting and conserving biodiversity and sustainability and sustainably managing living natural resources are the key for this development. So there is also now a worldwide concern about rapid human-caused biodiversity loss. And to be honest, climate change is one of the biggest topics right now that we deal regarding the environment, but biodiversity is becoming, in a way, new climate change, because there's more and more realization of how important it is for the sustainable development and actually sustaining the life on Earth. So currently, the biodiversity losses are mainly due to the habitat loss and degradation, invasive non-native species, which is quite important in the Pacific context, overharvest, direct and incidental take, and also climate change. And climate change, you know, we don't even need to mention the importance of it and how to be climate resilient in the Pacific. It is fundamental. So then why focus on biodiversity in Pacific? And I mean, I'm really happy to see that there are more than 857 protected areas in the Pacific, covering more than 4.8 million kilometers. And 303 of these are terrestrial and 554 are marine. So it is really quite a large area to be protected. And these are just some facts that we got from the SPREP sites, from the internet, and also from the general knowledge. So we know that Pacific Island is actually 10% of the world's oceans, and that Pacific biodiversity ensures strength and resilience against climate change and natural disaster. This is definitely a key. So We have 32% of the coral reefs inside designated protected area. We have half of 200 migratory species in the Pacific are currently in decline. 70% of known key biodiversity area is also under the protected area. The value, for example, is that seagrass capture carbon actually 35 times faster than the tropical rainforest. There is a very high level of endemism in PNG and Solomon Islands, and the Pacific has most coral reef species in the world, and it also has 70% of the global fish catch in the world actually comes from the Pacific. So there is definitely no need to go into more details why preserving biodiversity is so important in the Pacific. So when we talk about ESS6, I just wanted to give you a short background on actually what is this ESS6 and where does it come from, and how does the World Bank actually tackle the biodiversity issue. So there are two ways. First is, when you have a direct support to the project, direct project support, that means that you have a project that deals with the biodiversity, conservation, etc. And that is, one rounded project that has clear objective at the preservation of biodiversity. But in the other hand, for all the projects in the World Bank, no matter if that is a road project, a school project, a health project, it can be anything, a governance project, we will, based on the environmental and social framework, assess this project and decide and try to pinpoint how does this project impact the biodiversity, because majority of these projects are definitely going to have some construction, so that means direct impact on site. But we also very much focus on the projects that include spatial planning, because spatial planning might not have now a direct impact on biodiversity, but in time, it will actually might actually have quite significant impact on biodiversity. So these standards are actually designed to help governments manage project risks and impact and improve environmental and social performance. This is all done according to the good international and national practice, but also all the international obligations like the Ramsar's protocol, etc. So these are the 10 standards that we actually assess the project against, every project that we finance. And the most predominant one is so-called ESS1, which talks about the assessment and management of environmental and social risk and impacts. Let's call that this project is actually what we call, let's prepare the environmental social management plan or environmental social impact assessment for the project. But for the other 9 or 8 standards, they are relevant in not all cases, but in some of the specific cases. So ESS6 is relevant when we have some potentially biodiversity, but when our project has some potential biodiversity and conservation issues. So I think Ofelia already mentioned in ESS6 why focus on biodiversity. So these are the objectives. I will not go through all of this because I think she already mentioned, but it's definitely to protect and conserve, also to apply mitigation hierarchy and precautionary approach, and also to promote sustainable management of living natural resources. But one thing that I would specifically like to mention is that we cannot distinguish our habitats and biodiversity from livelihood, because people need the ecological services. So the conservation of the biodiversity is also important to support livelihood of local communities, including indigenous people, and that is called inclusive economic development that we actually strive for. So the ESS6, which is in its full name, Biodiversity Conservation and Sustainable Management of Living Natural Resources, recognizes that protecting and conserving biodiversity is fundamental to sustainable development, that there is importance of maintaining core ecological functions of habitats, that there is definitely, it also recognizes and addresses sustainable management of primary production and harvesting of living natural resources. and also recognizes the need to consider the livelihood of project affected parties, especially indigenous people, and that the positive role of the project affected parties in biodiversity conservation and sustainable management of living natural resources is considered. Because we will talk a bit later about this, you can have a perfect biodiversity management plan on the paper, but if you don't have a buy-in from the local community, from the people living in the area, this biodiversity management plan will just stay a piece of paper. So definitely you cannot think about protecting diversity without having people supporting this. I don't know, I just want to ask, is this all for now clear? Is my pace too fast, etc.? Or is it okay? Can you all hear me properly?
You can maybe type that in the chat box, or
yeah,
just
okay.
and say.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up to see that everything is fine. So what is biodiversity? It has been on the international agenda, specifically since 1992, when we had the Convention of Biological Diversity. So according to the Convention of Biological Diversity, it is defined as variability among living organisms from all sources, including inter alia terrestrial, marine, and other ecosystems and ecological complexes of which they are part of. This includes diversity within species, between species, and of ecosystems. So whatever international cooperation or institutions, your organization you're working, either the World Bank, ADB, KFW, or other, everybody actually adopted this definition of biodiversity and are focusing quite a lot on preservation and conservation. So a bit, hello? I thought I had a question. So what is actually a habitat when we talk? So there are some basic terminology that we need to understand before we can try to dig into especially differentiated approach. So when we talk about a habitat, so it's a terrestrial, freshwater, or marine geographical unit or airway that supports assemblage of living organisms and their interactions with non-living environment. All habitats support complexities of living organisms and vary in terms of species diversity, abundance, and importance. And this variation actually brought us to defining 3 types of habitats regarding their sensitivities and values. So for example, one of the most common habitats that we have, and we sometimes don't even consider it as a habitat, is the modified habitat. And this is, these are the urban surroundings, where a large proportion of plant and or animal species are non-native in origin. So for example, in the urban surrounding, you have cats, you have mouses, etc., which are not definitely, a native species, but they are very typical for the modified habitat. And this is the habitat where human activity has substantially modified an area's primary ecological function and species composition. So just to give you a few examples of modified habitats. Not all modified habitats have biodiversity value. We have to be very clear about that. But some of those would have a significant biodiversity value. And here are a few examples. For example, if there is an orchard or horticultural field that provides pollen and nectar for bees and other pollinators, that immediately makes this modified habitat relevant, and then in this case, ESS 6 applies. Another example is when you have abundant quarries that provide habitat for migratory birds and wetland species. Or you can have managed livestock pastures that also provide seasonal grazing for the wildlife. So these would all be modified habitat. However, they have certain value, and in this case, they are relevant, so-called, to ESS 6. Then we have the natural habitats. which is, the habitats that contain viable assemblage of species of largely native origin, and where human activity has not essentially modified an area's primary ecological function and species. That implies, for example, that human presence is there in this natural habitat, but however, they still function as ecosystem. And examples are forests, grasslands, mountain areas, which are large enough to fill ecological functions and whose resources may be used for economic purposes, but not to the extent that they have lost their natural characteristics. And as a third category, we have so-called critical habitats. And these are the areas of very high biodiversity importance and value. And those usually include significant importance to the critically endangered and endangered species, like you have the red list, IUCN red list. Significant importance of endemic or restricted range species. Those are the habitats that support globally or nationally significant concentration of migratory or congregatory species. Highly threatened or unique ecosystem, or ecological functions needed to maintain viability or biodiversity values from A to B. So often, critical habitats include those areas either legally protected or that are officially proposed for protection, such as areas that meet the criteria of World Conservation Union classification, Ramsar sites, and UNESCO World Natural Heritage Site. But please know that our protection system nowhere in the world is perfect, and there are definitely critical habitats outside of these protected areas.
Yes.
So when we talk about critical habitats, we cannot specifically say that only critical species are in those. Also, we have a different level of protection, which implies that maybe some natural habitats are protected. Not all what is protected is actually a critical habitat. So just to give you a few examples of the critical habitats, that's like remote pristine islands, largely intact natural forests and wetlands, high mountain habitats, which are often used for relict species, and this kind of habitats. So when we talk about habitats and biodiversity, we definitely have to mention ecosystem services. And ecosystem services are actually benefits that people derive from ecosystems. And those are all very valuable to humans. Those are the services that we get from the environment, from biodiversity. And we usually distinguish 4 types of ecosystem services. One is the provisioning services. So for example, those are the products that people obtain from the ecosystem, like you get water from ecosystem, you get fish from the oceans, etc. So all this is actually your provisioning service ecosystem services. Then you have the regulating services, and this is the benefit that people obtain from regulation of ecosystem processes. For example, there are surface water purification, climate regulation that actually protect the environment, that also helps people. There is also cultural services. For example, in many ecosystem and habitats, you have sacred sites, recreational area, which actually provide value to people. And also you have the supporting services, the natural processes that maintain the other services, for example, soil formation, nutrient cycling, and primary production. So just before I go into the what actually protection is required for different habitat types, I just wonder if anybody has questions so far. You don't have to have, but if you do, please don't shy away. If not, we can continue. So when we talk about protection of this habitat, given that these 3 types of habitat, modified habitat, natural habitat, and critical habitat, actually have different value from diversity point of view, and they have a different sensitivity, we also use different type of approach in protecting those. So this is why we call it a differentiated approach. So when we talk about modified habitats, if we need to protect them, then what we do is to avoid or minimize impacts as much as possible and implement mitigation measures as appropriate. When we have natural habitats, we carry our activities with potential adverse impact only in cases there are no technically and financially feasible alternatives. There are appropriate mitigation measures in place. And of course, if there is some residual impact that remains after our best efforts to avoid, minimize, and mitigate, as a last resort, we may consider so-called biodiversity offset, which I will explain in the next few slides. And that's if it's supported by relevant stakeholders, implying if these measures are supported by the local people living in the area, if adhere to the principles like for like or better, and if there is no net loss or biodiversity value, and if there's preferably a net gain. So I will just in the next slide explain all this terminology, so please bear with me. So then when we talk about critical habitats, usually for us in the bank, if there is a proposal to have a project with some kind of construction in the critical habitat, for us, this is no go. There are certain cases where we actually might consider some investments in the critical habitats. And this slide actually identifies that all these conditions needs to be met. So not only one or two, but all these need to be met in order to proceed with the investments in this type of habitat. So there are no other viable alternatives within the region in the area with lesser biodiversity value, that all relevant requirements under international obligations or national laws have been complied with, that potential impacts are not likely to result in a net reduction of biodiversity values, that there is no anticipated net reduction in population, no significant conservation or degradation of critical habitats, that it's designed to achieve net gain, and there's going to be a long-term monitoring and evaluation program, and it's integrated in the government management program. So fulfilling all these conditions and criteria just to have some investments in the critical habitat, it's quite difficult. So it's not impossible, but I would have to say that we do avoid investments in the critical habitats because of all these difficult conditions, and which are there for a reason. So now I just wanted to do a quick knowledge check, if that is okay with you. I'm not sure if you are going to enjoy this, but as I mentioned, there's not really 100% correct and 100% wrong answer. So maybe just in the chat, if you can write, first question is, to which of the above habitats ESS is likely to apply? So these are the 5 habitats. You have intact tropical forests that contain to numerous endemic tree species, an aquaculture operation that is used as a stopover by migratory birds, an island which is home to the last remaining population of numerous critical endangered species. Then we have a mangrove swamp that has long been used by local communities for fishing and firewood. And we have a monoculture pine plantation. I don't know, let me see if I can see the chat. So the first question is, to which of the above habitats is ESS 6 likely to apply? If you're too shy, I will say the answer, but I would, okay, we have great, first, all, okay. Anybody has a different opinion? Thank you for volunteering to this. Okay, and the correct, which might be correct answer is that possibly all, but there might be a possibility that monoculture pine plantation is actually a very highly modified habitat and a simplified habitat unlikely to contain significant biodiversity. So as you can see, actually all could be, but then pine plantations might not be. And this is something where we have to actually look at the case-by-case scenario and, does this pine plantations actually have significant species, bees, or etc. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the answer to all these questions is not straightforward. There's not black and white. So thank you for the answers and proactivity. So on the second questions, what type of habitat does each of these present? So maybe I can just ask you to write down which habitat you would consider a critical habitat here. Unless if somebody wants to talk, then it's easier to answer what is modified, what is natural, and what is critical. But otherwise, maybe in the chat, you can just write what do you consider a critical habitat in this case? Okay, good answer. Iceland home forest. Critical could be all except pine. Island is a critical habitat. Okay, island with critical endangered species. Okay, thank you for this. So again, as mentioned before, it doesn't have to be black and white because we need data and information to support our decision. So definitely from this description, the intact tropical forest and islands that is home to endangered species could be critical. Island definitely would be a critical. But also, the mangrove forest, mangrove swamp could be critical, although people are present there. They might contain a critical species, but the very clear answer is the island that is home to the endangered species. That is quite critical. But you might also consider intact tropical forest and also the mangrove swamp in some instances. So now the third questions. In which of the above habitats would the project need to achieve a net gain? So like it's a must. So we cannot just think about any other solutions. It must achieve a net gain of biodiversity, which implies that it has to, when you implement the project, that the value of biodiversity at the end of the project needs to be higher than it was there at the beginning. So would that be moderate, critical, modified, critical, or natural habitats? So would it be intact tropical forest, an island, a monoculture, an aquaculture operation, or the mangrove swamp? Any thoughts? Okay, that's the correct answer, that critical habitats needs net gain. So in these cases, it would be definitely also an island with the last remaining population of numerous critically endangered species, but also an intact tropical forest that contains numerous endemic tree species. So thank you for the answers. And now the last question. In which of these of the above habitats, it's likely that residual impact of the project could not be offset? So what does this mean? So if you have a project and you have some impact of biodiversity, and in one of these cases, you cannot offset it somewhere else because it's unique to this place, and there is probably no other solutions. Yeah, exactly. It's the island. So if this island is home to the last remaining population of some species, whatever you do on this island, you will endanger the critical species and their last remaining. If there are no present anywhere else, it is very, very difficult to offset this because there are no these populations thriving or sustaining anywhere else. Thank you for these questions. I hope this made you a bit more alive. So let us now go to the next slide, where I will try to explain all this terminology that we very often use, and that's the net loss, net gain, restoration, adverse loss, like for like, trading up, etc. So when we talk about biodiversity offsets, you have to know that these are conservation actions with variable outcomes that compensate for residual adverse biodiversity impacts. So if you have a project, this project will definitely have a certain type of impact. And if it's in some kind of natural habitat, it will have the impact on biodiversity. So when we talk about offset, we mean like what is left, the impact that is left that cannot be tackled. How do we compensate for this impact? So usual goal is so-called with the project no net loss, or a net gain. So no net loss is defined as the point in which the project-related biodiversity losses are balanced by gain. So by gains resulting from measures taken to avoid and minimize these impacts. So that means that you will have some impacts of biodiversity, but you will also have some enrichment mitigation measures that will make no net biodiversity loss in this area. So it's balanced by the gains. Then when we talk about net gain, when we talk about net gain, so these are the additional conservation outcomes that can be achieved for biodiversity values for which the natural or critical habitats are designed. For example, it can be so-called biodiversity offsets, or in instances when there is no offset, you could actually, through the implementation of additional program in situ, to enhance the habitats and protect conservation of biodiversity. So the next term here that we have is this ecological similarity. So when we try to do the net gain or no net loss, we talk about ecological similarity, like for like, or sometimes trading up. So when we say like for like, it means that in most cases, biodiversity offsets should be designed to conserve the same biodiversity values that are being affected by the project. So it's so-called in-kind offset. But in certain situations, areas of biodiversity to be affected by the project may be neither national nor local priority, and there may be other areas of biodiversity with like values that are higher priority for conservation. So it doesn't even have to be in this area; it can be outside of this area. And sustainable use and under intermittent threat, or it might need protection or effective management. So in this situation, it may be appropriate to consider so-called out-of-kind offset that involves trading up, which means that we offset targets biodiversity of higher priority than the affected by the project, but somewhere else. So in this way, regardless of the type, any areas considered as offset for residual adverse impacts in critical habitats will also be a critical habitat. So whenever we do the offset, that means that that area also will be a critical habitat. So these are the terminologies that we use very often, but it's very important that you understand no net loss. That means that your project cannot cause loss of biodiversity, that actually your mitigation measures have to make the biodiversity loss balanced. So no loss, no gain. Net gains when we want to do something even additionally more. Like for like is when we do it in kind offset, and trading up when we do preservation of some other higher biodiversity value area outside of the project scope, but still it is of higher biological importance. So when we consider biodiversity offset, we always talk about mitigation hierarchy, and you have heard about this, avoid, minimize, mitigate, or restore, and offset. So just to let us emphasize that biodiversity offset is actually our last resort. So The key thing, the best thing that you can do when we talk about natural habitats or critical habitats, and especially critical habitats, is to avoid. Because prevention is always better than the cure, and the siting and trying to find a proper project site, it's the best way to actually avoid impact on certain kind of area. So locating the project area away from the sites of high biodiversity conservation value. It also includes avoiding carefully locating infrastructure within the design project area, avoiding the use of certain very damaging technologies, and avoiding of certain type of problematic activities during specific times of year. For example, do not do certain kind of things during the breeding period or migration period. And then in addition to avoiding, you have minimize, restore, and offset. And to be honest, these are very good type of mitigation hierarchy activities that you can do, but none is as good as avoiding, really the critical habitat or natural habitat with high biodiversity importance. So you can minimize, the sea can minimize any such damage, restore, consider how to restore sites or species population, and offset, which we just briefly talked about. So the next part of this presentation, I would like to talk about how do we tackle biodiversity in environmental assessment. And please know that any EIA around the world will have to include the material threat to the protection, conservation, and maintenance and restoration of natural habitats and biodiversity. So no matter are we following the World Bank guidance, ADB, or the national guidance, biodiversity today is definitely recognized and need to be tackled in environmental impact assessment. The important thing is to emphasize that we need to consider direct, indirect, and cumulative project-related impacts on habitats and biodiversity support. So in reality, there are certain type of management and approaches we need to use, and that's one of them. It's called adaptive management. Another one is called precautionary approach. So let me start with the precautionary approach. These two are actually two mechanisms and strategies for managing risk when faced with a high degree of uncertainties. And to be honest, wherever we work with the biodiversity of habitats, you will never have enough information. You will never have enough data. There will always be a potential to have even more baseline study, etc. So at one point in project preparation, you need to decide what is enough to proceed with the decision. So precautionary approach, there's this saying that we say that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So there is absolute knowledge and certainly are very rare. And you have to, as a practitioners, be capable to make a judgment call when something is enough or when something is sufficient. So in the precautionary approach, the emphasis is on avoiding actions with potentially harmful and particularly with irreversible consequences until there is sufficient information available to properly assess and weigh the likely cons and benefits. It's also advice from technical experts and stakeholder consultation should be used to determine what information is sufficient for decision making. And there's also residual uncertainties. Very often, it's common to leave a margin of error, at least until the estimate can be redefined. So we deal with a complex system. It's difficult, if not impossible, to make reliable prediction concerning the longer term impacts of the project. Surveys should cover biologically important periods when we do the surveys, breeding, migratory, dry wet seasons, and these things takes time. Projects usually need to be delivered much faster, so we need to be very precautious in how we plan. It can be done in parallel with the environmental and social impact assessment, but it's always good to have surveys and baseline study done before. So the other mechanism that we also talk quite a lot is the adaptive management. And adaptive management involves adjusting actions and approaches based on the results of ongoing monitoring and outcomes. There is, when we prepare the environmental social impact assessment, there's definitely constraints of information and whenever you establish a biodiversity monitoring, there's going to be new information that might change the circumstances during the project implementation. This is what we call that, whatever we had at the beginning of the project, it's not carved in stone. We have to fine tune it and adjust it as the monitoring data provide us and guide us. So, and for this, it is especially important that we have implementing arrangements and institutional setup need to be cleared so we can actually have the adaptive management. So just an example, if you take a wind farm and you do the monitoring of birds and bat mortality at the wind farm, so you might actually change the turbine cut in speed to reduce the bat fatalities, or shut down even during the peak bird use periods. So this is called adaptive management, that you have to, based on your monitoring and your data, adapt your mitigation measures. Similarly, the monitoring of the river edge forest or wetland might lead to recommendations for changing the water flow release from the dam. If you see that you have the ecological flow defined at the dam and that you see that the forest or wetland is actually dying off, of course you will change and increase the water. So you adapt based on the monitoring results. I see a baby crying. Good to hear that we have also a very young audience. So these are now the principles that I lay down here. I think we are quite tight with the time. So I might not go in details with all these principles to promote biodiversity. And this is how to actually include biodiversity into impact assessments. These are the principles that are developed by the IAIA, it's the International Association of Impact Assessment Practitioners. And these are the 9 key principles. So I'll just go quickly through it, not to go too much into the details. So use impact assessment to maintain and enhance biodiversity, try to have no net loss, integrate biodiversity in development planning as early as possible, because it takes time to get the data and sufficient for decision making. Take an ecological perspective to framing the impact assessment. Don't focus species by species, look at the ecosystems. Then you have address the rights, value, and dependencies and benefits that people derive from biodiversity of ecosystems. So for example, if you are protecting a certain type of forest and there is lots of illegal wood harvesting, etc. in that part, your biodiversity plan will be just a piece of paper if you don't stimulate the local community to help you in this. So inclusion of the local people in preparation of biodiversity plan, what is actually possible and what is not possible is the key for the success of any biodiversity action plan. Then you have design impact assessment baseline survey. It has to be evidence-based and done really, really in advance. Ensure that implications for biodiversity and ecosystems are fully addressed, and apply mitigation hierarchy where needed. Use precautionary approach where you don't have sufficient data. And of course, one very important thing so you can do the adaptive management is to establish a robust adaptive management system. That means monitoring throughout the project implementation, not only for preparation, but implementation. So biodiversity management plan to be successful, they need to be implemented. And for that, you need to have institutional setup and people who will be in charge for this. So this is just a brief explanation of what biodiversity action plan actually is. It will be assessment that will consider threats to biodiversity. And sometimes we do a separate biodiversity action plan when we have higher issues or need to be done separately. and it cannot be done as part of the environmental impact assessment. And the need for a separate one will be defined at the beginning of preparation of the ESIA. So the plan will determine the significance of biodiversity or habitats based on their vulnerability and irreplaceability at the global, regional, national level. But it will also take into account what we talked about, differentiated values. I mean, is this a natural habitat? Is this a modified habitat or a critical habitat? This is just the list of what actually one good biodiversity management plan needs to include: objectives, biodiversity related activities to carry out, project requirements, rules for the contractor, implementation schedule. I cannot emphasize enough, institutional responsibility need to be very clear. You also have to have, cost estimates, so that, and also funding sources to be done. When we deal with the bank, for majority of these biodiversity management plan, the key provisions will actually be in the financial and legal agreement. So when we are addressing biodiversity conservation in practice, ecosystems and their biodiversity contribute to human well-being in a variety of ways, some of which are difficult to quantify in monetary terms. And that means that, when you deal with people and their values, it is very difficult, and also biodiversity. What does it mean if there's no longer one protected coral on the many coral species that you have? How do you actually put that in monetary terms? It's not always easy. You have to include the contribution to health, traditional livelihoods, cultural, spiritual, and religious enrichment. These values and benefits are overlooked, especially the ones that are important for the people. And this results often in the failure to internalize significant costs and risks. And there's also often failure to recognize risk to biodiversity that creates serious long-term liabilities for developers, and failure to recognize critical dependencies of people on biodiversity may result in contravention of human rights, undermine irreplaceable cultural traditions, or elicit major resistance from affected communities. So whenever you do your biodiversity management plan, involve the stakeholders and local community as soon as possible, because they are crucial for the success of your plan. And this actually leads me to my last slide, and that's the stakeholder engagement in assessment of impact of biodiversity. So habitats vary in their significance for conservation globally, regionally, and nationally. It's important. There's sensitive impacts, and in the significance different stakeholders attribute to them. Also, in assessing impacts of proposed project activities to biodiversity, stakeholder involvement is crucial, especially in considering the options for biodiversity offsets. And what is also important to know, that you can do surveys, you can do many things, but actually stakeholders, your local people, might have very, very valuable information on the biodiversity values and sensitivities in the area. So good practice is to involve stakeholders from the outset, ensure coordination between conservation and main project agency. Advice from technical expert and stakeholder consultation should be used to determine what information is sufficient for decision making. And the benefits of this involvement of the stakeholder is leveraging local ecological knowledge, understanding the value of traditional ecosystems, and learning how natural resources are used, and avoiding potential resource conflicts. And this is my last slide. This slide, you will have this shared slide with you. So this is just the information where you can get more information about the ESS, but also from SPREP on biodiversity values in the area. And I will now stop my sharing now. Sorry, let me just see how to do that. Okay.
Thanks, Natasha. Before we go on to Dr. Hilda's presentation. Can we just address some of the questions that have been raised? There's a question here from Margaret. At what stage of the project consider offset? Projects are mainly site specific, and looking at offset would involve other government agencies that don't directly implement a project.
This is a very, very good question, because, for example, if you have, for example, a small hydropower plant, and you have the energy company that is going to build it in a mountain range or the forest, but actually forest is under protection of completely different agency. It could be a forest management, it can be the Ministry of Environment, etc. And this what makes, the biodiversity management plan quite complicated. And here we go back to the stakeholder consultation, but also setting up a proper implementation and institutional setup. Without consent from this, for example, forest management or Ministry of Environment, your biodiversity action plan will not work. Even when you think about, one small hydropower plant, this whole area might have different pressures that impact this biodiversity. So it is actually quite complex approach that needs to put together at the table both the developer, the potential contractor, whoever is in charge of this management of this area, but also Ministry of Environment, etc. So the answer is not very simple. It is complicated. That's why with every biodiversity management plan, institutional setups are very, very important, and they often go beyond the developer. There are some projects that you have really a small footprint impact that the developer can actually handle. But if we talk about larger residual impact, then you have to also include other government and also local stakeholders.
Okay, thanks, Natasha. Another question here is from Marista. In the event that offsetting is necessary in a project development, how can this be enforced to ensure that this is being implemented?
Thank you. Again, so a good biodiversity management plan, again, needs to have properly defined responsibility and institutional setups. And those have to be agreed way in advance. And in addition to that, it has to have financing for the monitoring that is going to go beyond a year, because the contractor will construct whatever he does in 2 years, 3 years time, but your biodiversity action plan has much longer period for being implemented. And again, we go back here to the stakeholders, to dealing with many institutions and defining a biodiversity action plan, which will have very easily defined actions, institutional setup, responsibilities, and funding for the monitoring and implementation later on. Without that, you just have a piece of paper.
All right. We have another question here from Anna Bing. Can you offset 2,200 square meters of mangroves required for a bridge abutment or landing by replanting new mangroves in the only available area on the island, even though the mangrove species will be different?
Honestly, we have to look more into details but this would be so-called trading off or offset outside, and it would be possible. I mean, I'm kind of putting a boundary here because, I'm talking about just theoretically, it needs to be looked in more details, but it would be possible. However, much more information would be needed for decision making. But in theory, you could offset this in another area if you use the mangroves that are also of higher biodiversity or the same biodiversity value. They don't have to be the same species, but they would have to be same biodiversity or higher biodiversity value.
Okay, we have another question here from Moon. It says, looking at the precautionary approach, I am having difficulty with the terms irreversible harm and insufficient evidence. How would you address this, please, to justify applying the precautionary approach and convince the stakeholders and decision makers? That's a good question.
I wish I could have a definite answer to this.
Yeah.
So that would be so easy then. I mean, and this is the work we do. It's very often a judgment call. It's very often that you rely on your specific biodiversity expert that will advise you. We are not experts for all. And as mentioned in one of the slides, you always have to leave some margin of error for residual impact, because your judgment call in this case might be, to a certain extent wrong. So it's not, definition sounds easy on the paper, but when you try to do that in practice, you will learn that it's very difficult to, it's not that tangible. It's very difficult to pinpoint it, and that you will have to make a certain decision on this. What is sufficient for you and what is not. But please know that for this, you need to have a good expert team. You need to do a proper baseline study and have sufficient information for decision.
Yeah, very good. That's good answer to this very difficult question. Okay, we're just going to take one more question before we go on to Dr. Hilda's input from Mole. This one is from Margaret. Can you share an experience where a World Bank funded project where critical biodiversity are protected, or project design was modified to ensure protection?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if anybody here is from Solomon. We just have now this Tina River hydropower plant example, where actually the project started, but then the question due to the monitoring, etc., raised that there might be actually critical species present in the both aquatic and terrestrial habitats. So right now, additional baseline study and research are being done just to make a decision if you proceed or not to proceed. And I have to say that these situations are quite difficult, especially because this critical habitat was not recognized at the beginning immediately. So I think in majority of the cases, we would avoid critical habitats. And I wouldn't say there are many projects where this was done. These projects are under big scrutiny. Also, we have lots of NGOs involved in this, and not many. So I think one of the example in Solomon Island is the Tina River, and now everything stopped, and we are doing additional, the government, etc., is doing the additional survey to make a decision on critical habitat. So, I mean, I think this is going to be also probably in some kind of news or I think interesting case study when this is done. So now we are in a phase of doing the additional research, and it has been lasting for a year. So these projects are not easy, and they really have to be a last resort to proceed with those.
Great, thank you so much, Natasha, for the answers. Because of our time, can we just now get on to Dr. Hilda's presentation, and if there's anything further, we can look into that after.
I would just like to answer later, because there was this very good question about financial offsets, but I'll answer that if the time allows after Dr. Hilda's presentation.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Natasha and Ophira. I'll just share my slide now. Okay, so I think that was a very good presentation from Natasha, and quite informative in terms of biodiversity assessment and management in EIAs. The next presentation is more a Pacific context to the challenges or hurdles that are currently faced in the Pacific. And this is mainly focused on biodiversity assessments and management in EIAs. So the challenges have been categorized into 5 major themes. And the first is due to limited data and limited access to biological data from the Pacific Island countries. There's insufficient data for baseline biodiversity assessments from Pacific Island countries. Most Pacific Island countries lack taxonomic ecological data that can inform biodiversity assessments and reporting. There is also limited access to data and data sharing between ministries, NGOs, research institutions, and to end users. And usually getting consent to access these available data usually takes a long process for most. The other category is due to limited in-country expertise. And I believe this is for most Pacific Island countries. There's limited technical in-country expertise in the various fields of taxonomy, ecology, conservation, and biodiversity to undertake biodiversity assessments for EIA. It would be recommended that national regulatory authorities register all qualified national consultants for EIA biodiversity assessments, and this would ensure that quality of reports are met and also the standard that they are aligned to national standards and guidelines. Also, there's need for the EIA Technical Review Committee within the regulatory authority to be well qualified in the areas of biodiversity and conservation, and this would allow them to make sound recommendations on the reports that do get submitted. Sorry, the third one is on limited enforcement and monitoring. There's need for strict enforcement by national regulatory authorities to ensure compliance to regulations and that standards are met. Monitoring plans are recommended in the environmental management plan for biophysical assessments, and these need to be undertaken as scheduled. And due to that, there is need for personnel within the regulatory authorities to be identified and costs budgeted for on-site visits, monitoring, audits, and reporting. And this is usually not the case for many Pacific Island countries. And that's where we lack in terms of enforcement and monitoring from the regulatory authorities. The fourth category, what the biodiversity study must consider. And in most assessments, these studies have not been factored in. First is seasonality and breeding of migratory seasons for assessments of both flora and fauna. There's also need in biodiversity assessments for thorough assessments on conservation value of the area. And when we talk about conservation value, we're looking at biodiversity hotspots of the area in terms of threatened species, rare, endemic, or endangered species. We also need to consider an assessment on the ecosystem services provided. And this was thoroughly covered by Natasha in her previous presentation, where she talks about ecosystem services in terms of provisioning regulatory, cultural, and support services. And also for Pacific Island countries, we are currently being faced with the impacts of climate change. So there's a need to integrate the impacts of climate change into biodiversity assessments. And some studies that have been currently done to address this are the ecological niche modeling or species distribution models that predict distribution patterns for either threatened or rare species or the distribution of invasive species under current and future climatic scenarios. And by doing these modeling studies and integrating climate change, it will ensure that more appropriate mitigative measures are also considered in the management plans. Also for the Pacific, this is quite contextual and quite relevant. For the Pacific, the integration or the inclusion of traditional ecological knowledge or local knowledge into biodiversity studies. For example, in Fiji, the presence of species that are of cultural significance or being referred to as totems. These are plants and or animals that are representative of a symbol for family or tribe. And they have cultural significance, and these also need to be integrated into biodiversity assessment studies for EIAs. The last category is the lack of community resource owners' involvement. And like many resource owners in the Pacific, there's need for better information to be disseminated to the resource owners, and more awareness and education around the EIA process to ensure better decision making from their end. Also, we've seen limited participation in biodiversity assessments by the resource owners, and also the involvement in monitoring and reporting. It is also encouraged that surveys, when they are undertaken by technical experts, that local parataxonomists are also included for on-site training while surveys are being conducted. Okay, so that pretty much sums up the challenges we currently face in the Pacific, or the hurdles that prevents us from doing good biodiversity assessments and management in the areas of EIA. And I welcome any questions or discussions around this. And that brings me to the end of my presentation, and I'll give the time back to our host, Ophira Vidaka.
Thank you, Dr. Hilda. Thank you so much for taking us back to the reality of our work here, especially as practitioners in the area of ESS, and also for regulators. Those are some of the realities that we face on the ground. And thank you, Ms. Natasha, for also giving us the insights of what is expected from our World Bank, from the World Bank in conducting these biodiversity assessments in our EIAs. So can we take it back to the to that comment that you were talking about, Natasha, that was addressing the financial offsetting?
Yes, I think this was asked by Della. The question was, for small islands nation, where land is largely customary owned, does the bank include compensation of land to be used for offsetting in the project? And my worry is the preference of financial offset by projects over biodiversity offsetting. So we have to here distinguish two things. One is when we talk about resettlement or taking the land from biodiversity issue. Biodiversity offset is never financial offset. These are two separate things. You can remove people from certain area or financially compensate them, but we separate that from the biodiversity protection. It might be some implication, but those things should be both tackled, you know, resettlement of the people, movement, but also preserving of the biodiversity. Biodiversity offset is never financial. It really has to be a trade-off. And these two things can actually work in parallel. They don't have to be one either other. And usually in our projects, these two things happen in parallel, not one or the other.
Great. Yes. So I hope that that's answered your question, Della. There's one more question here from Watia Salesa. Would there be a need to separate the role or function of government as a regulator or assessor and operator or practitioner in undertaking or carrying out ESF and ESS?
Sorry, can you just trying to find, it's one of the last comments.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. So would there be a need to separate the role function of government as a regulator and operator, practitioner, undertaking, carrying out the ESF? So, I mean, like in every country, you would usually have a project implementation unit. For example, if there is a Ministry of Transport, if there is a Ministry of Maritime Affairs, Ministry of Forestry, etc., you would have the project unit, a developer there, but that does not preclude the Ministry of Environment, a separate ministry, a separate department to do the regulatory work and check the quality of this environmental social impact assessment. This is no different like the bank supported project or any other supported project. There's absolutely no difference. We always have to comply with the national requirements. Sometimes the bank requires some additionality, but as a basic national compliance need to be there. So definitely the government as a regulator needs to do its work in the assessing of the documents. What needs to be avoided is that the regulator is the same time is the preparing of the documents, but we don't have that very often. So usually have a different government unit, different institution that does the project, and then the regulator really needs to be independent and separate to properly judge the quality of the environmental social impact assessment or ESIA.
Great, thanks for that, Ms. Natasa. Here's one from Merbello. Does USB have an in-house clearinghouse? This is for Dr. Hilda. Does USB have an in-house clearinghouse mechanism for biophysical data collected from their applied research that could help to establish baseline for individual PICs? And if so, what is the process to access these data?
Thank you, Mayor Pello, for that question. For USP, we have the South Pacific Regional Herbarium that has a database for vegetation for Fiji and some of the Pacific Island countries. And usually for that, you need to get consent from the herbarium botanist, Mr. Marika Tuiwawa. He oversees that collection facility. But for other biophysical data, there's student researchers that are available online, and you can access this on the USP website, where electronic theses of students that have done biophysical assessments for different study areas could be available if it's done within your area of interest. So those are few repositories that I'm aware of that has biophysical data. The Institute of Applied Science also has a repository for EIA reports and biodiversity data at the Institute, and you should be able to access their website online and also their repositories. And that's held by the Institute of Applied Science here at USP. So those are a few repositories that I'm aware of at USP that you are able to access some biodiversity data from. Vinaka.
Thank you for that information, Dr. Hilda. I will get that from you, and then we'll post it up on our discussion forum in the PNEA portal. Here's an interesting question from Aminiasi. Is political decision influencing biodiversity? Maybe he is asking, is political influencing our decisions for developing on our biodiversity resources or something like that, along those lines?
My not very politically correct answer would be that you know, they're always I'm sorry, I don't know how to say this to sound non-offensive or anyway. So you will always have in certain countries some political pressures for certain projects and the decision that are going to be pushed without having proper information, etc. It just seems more focused on the economic development than focusing on sustainable, the environment, social, etc. And those would always exist in the countries because at the beginning, when the planning, those sound easier than looking at the sustainability, etc. of the project. So yes, this situation will happen, but then there is a academic community, the experts, the NGOs that would also need to kind of put a bit of pressure back to the politicians and kind of show the pros and cons of this approach, but also maybe even the benefits that can come from sustainable development. I'm not saying that in reality this is very successful, but there definitely needs to be a try.
Yes, good answer. Dr. Hilda, would you like to give your answer to this question?
Sorry, is this the last question you're referring to? Ofera?
This is the one about the political influence affecting our biodiversity.
I would try to refrain from answering that, but yes, at times there's political decisions that override an EIA process, and that's where the project development is a need for the country or the government. There's a need for construction of road or bridge or a dam, and sometimes government decisions do override the process of an EIA.
Yes. Okay, here's one from Lekima Copeland. She says, thank you, Hilda and Natasha, very informative. What about environmental bonds, for instance, in Fiji? Who looks after the bond, the government or the developer at the end of life of a project? For instance, in mining or hydro projects.
Nakima, I think I really don't know the answer to this. Thank you for the questions, but I might actually come back to you on this one when I talk maybe to some of our environmental economists who are more dealing with this. I apologize. It would be just a wild guess if I would answer this, so I do not have the answer.
Dr. Hilda?
Yeah, I share the same sentiments as Natasha Lekima on that question. So maybe we'll wait for Natasha to get back from the environmental economists at the World Bank to give a more definitive answer to that, Lekima.
Yes, I think that's a good plan. We have our discussion forum on the PNEA portal. We can also follow up on some of those questions, Lekima, if you can put that on there, and we can follow up with our presenters as well if any answers come to the fore.
Maybe just to answer to Della, because she elaborated
Della.
more on her question,
yeah.
just quickly.
Sure.
Thank you, Della, for explaining the situation. So I understand that there is a financial compensation to the people to leave the land that will be used for, biodiversity restoration. I have to say that in our policy, the financial compensation is the last resort, because people tend just to spend the money, and then issues just become more social issues instead of they don't buy usually the land, they usually spend the money, and that's our last kind of resort. Usually what we do is to try to provide a land, or especially if this is impacting the livelihood, to kind of do like for like to provide land or similar. Financial measures we do use sometimes, but very, very rarely. And I personally think it's not a good mechanism because potentially it creates even more social problems down the road.
Yes, that's a good response to that question. Here's one from Margaret. What are some policies to address the limitations to biodiversity data availability in the Pacific?
So depends on your project. You know, you use the local knowledge because local people will probably have some sense of information of biodiversity value. Also, you know, always try to use the mitigation hierarchy and avoid setting the projects in the area that it's going to, that you know, you don't know sufficient or you don't know enough. But if you still need to proceed in this area, try to engage the biodiversity survey or baseline study as early as possible. I know that Pacific lacks lots of data, but this is, I mean, it's not, I wouldn't say it's Pacific specific. I mean, in many developing countries, we don't have the data. There are also some of the international sites that can actually be used for predicting and assessing biodiversity. I will send it in the chat that people usually use for trying to estimate biodiversity in the area that can be used as a proxy. But as I said, try to avoid, do the survey in advance and use local knowledge to do the assessment or to have sufficient information for making a decision to move forward or not.
Okay, so here's a comment from our Cook Islands participants for our presenters. Thanks for the great presentation from the Cook Islands. It is something we are aiming to thrive within the scoping and assessment of EIA for clients. We like the registry idea of the biodiversity experts and something we will take on board. Yeah, we have our biodiversity database and hoping to have our staff more familiar with those to assist and advise our clients and benefits and beneficiaries, I think. Yes, that's very true. That's a good point. Sorry, and they go on to say, I believe we would like to push towards mapping our biodiversity hotspots to ensure we are able to advise our clients what mapping tool has been effective in other parts of the Pacific. So that's a comment from our Cook Islands participants. Any comments from our presenters on this?
Maybe Hilda can help more with this. I know that SPREP has some of the databases and planning and tools. Yeah, but I'm sorry, I don't know more than that. I don't know, Hilda maybe have more.
Yeah, from studies we undertake in Fiji in terms of biodiversity assessments and mapping biodiversity hotspots. Usually it's done by a GIS specialist using ArcGIS. And if there's any other, if there's integration of climate change assessments, there's also assessments that can be done around ecological niche models, where data can be accessed online for climate data and distribution data, which is collected from your surveys to be able to map out hotspot areas under current climate scenarios and also map it out for future scenarios. So it would be required that someone in the biodiversity team has a background in mapping or spatial analysis to be able to undertake those sorts of analysis in terms of mapping biodiversity hotspots and also integrating climate change data analysis for mapping current and future climate scenarios. So what we've done for Fiji. We have a biodiversity assessment team. We have specialists in the areas of vegetation, flora, fauna, invasive species, and we always have a GIS specialist who's also part of the team. And for any analysis that we will need, the GIS specialist undertakes that analysis on behalf of the team. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Dr. Hilda. Unfortunately, everyone, we are over our time. So I'll just take one more question here from Lekima to Natasha. With the Tina River Hydro Project, such an important national project for Solomon Islands, after recent baseline surveys, if there are species that are only found in that catchment and no other place in Guadalcanal, what would be the next steps for the safeguards team and the project moving forward?
Please know that I'm answering now this on behalf of myself, not the World Bank, because this decision will probably be made at the consortium of experts in the bank and the management, and I'm not personally involved in the project. But given that the project already started, there might be possibility to continue even with the critical habitat if there is really a very good offset done with definitely net gains. But honestly, at this stage, I cannot answer this. It is fully understandable that this is a government priority that has already started, but let's wait the data and then make a decision on it. I'm sorry I could not be. I'm sorry I could not give you a more precise answer because this will have to be decision delivered within the team, within the experts, including the government, including the bank and developer. So not an easy decision. But there is a possibility that also baseline will say that these critical species are not, that there might not be critical species, that they might be just in the next river gorge present as well. That will actually help with the decision. But yes, let's see first the data and then look at the options, and this will be decided by the team of experts. And I cannot just blunt in and tell you what's the preferred way.
Yes, thank you for that good point from Lekima, and also thank you for responding to that, Ms. Natasha. Unfortunately, everyone, we are now coming to the end of our time. Please be reminded that we have our discussion forum on PNEA. Please post any of your questions there. We can direct those questions to our presenters, or also our presenters can try to answer those in our PNA portal. But before I wrap this up, I'll just hand this back to our presenters for any final comments.
I don't know, I really thank you for this opportunity. It was actually a pleasure, and please don't shy, Feria, to share my email. If any of you have any questions or the concerns regarding the bank, how we work, and please know that everything I presented today is a good practice. It's not necessarily bank practice. It's something that should, good international practice. And no matter if you have the project with you or don't have a project with you, just please feel free to reach out, and I can try to help whatever I can. And I hope some of my answers will be more specific than just being very vague and explaining you that many things are actually a judgment call. So thank you for this.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Ofera and the organizing committee for giving us this platform to present on this module. And it was pleasure indeed to be part of this presentation team. Thanks, Natasha, and I believe Suzanne, was she also logged in, for the preparations towards these presentations. It was quite informative. Even I've also learned quite a few things from Natasha's presentation. And thank you for all the participants that have joined in today. I think we've reached quite a good number of ERA. So thanks for the questions, your interest into this module. And if there's any other queries, please feel free to email us and we can provide further clarifications to our presentations. Vinaka.
Thank you, ladies. Thank you so much for your valuable sharing today. You know, this is very important for us because when we go into biodiversity, this is like the core of our work. And so obviously this is a very comprehensive area that needs much more study and much more discussion in Talanoa. And so, but we are thankful to have had this session today with you ladies, and I believe that we have learned so much from this 1 hour and a half of sharing, and of course there is a potential for more. And so we pray that there will be another opportunity for us to come together again and talk on this area. But thank you so much for your sharing today. We are very blessed, and we are hoping for more opportunities in the future. And also a big thank you to all our participants from all around the Pacific. We're so happy to have you online. Thank you for your questions, and thank you for being brave to share your questions and your opinions, and we are thankful to have this forum that we can do this at this unprecedented time of lockdowns and virtual meetings. And so we're very thankful for that. Please tune in for our next module next week. It's also going to be a very exciting training session that's going to be on waste management and pollution control throughout the project life cycle in the Pacific. And we're also going to have another lineup of exciting presenters, just like today and our other previous sessions. Feel free to join us next week and spread the word to all your ESS friends. And remember, please don't forget to fill in the evaluation survey form that we're going to email out to you. That is going to ensure that you get your certificate, and also it's going to plan our any future opportunities for training for us. So please don't forget to do that. And I think that's it from me. Miss Joyce, are you there? May I please hand it over to you for our closing remarks? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fira, and thank you, Natasha and Dr. Hilda. It's been really wonderful to sit in and listen. Especially it's a topic that I'm, work closely with my colleagues, my environment colleagues with, but I keep learning every time. So thank you, Fira, and everyone for the training. I find this really useful, and it's been a really great opportunity to come together on this sort of platform and to continue to encourage each other. And I just wanted to say that, continue to come to the PLP, as Afira has been encouraging everyone. It's a really great opportunity to get to know who is who in the region as well, who's working on what projects in different countries. A lot of the World Bank environmental social risk management training that have been provided through the PLP, but also in each country specific, have really been covering a lot of the new ESF policies. So it's a great opportunity, I would like to say, for everyone at this time, to get together and to really build a great network of practitioners in the region. So Thank you, Afira. Great facilitation as always. And I really look forward to the next session. So thank you for that.
Thank you,
And
Joyce.
have a great day, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. See you next week. Take care and get back